Everyone, and welcome to Jerusalem. So I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he was basically telling me, he's a sedevacantist. He's got some issues with the SSPX because, if Pope Leo is not a legitimate pope, then adhering to him is automatically schism. You're outside of the church. This is absolutely wrong. No way. Okay, so here's my response. Even if sedevacantists are correct, the SSPX is still Catholic. The Society of St. Pius X is still legitimately Catholic, even if they're completely wrong about the recognize and resist position. Even if they're completely wrong about recognizing Pope Leo and all his predecessors as legitimate popes. So why am I making this video? I also probably think I will make a few other videos defending sedevacantists and the Fraternity of St. Peter at some point. Clearly, I don't agree with all these people. Clearly, I think each of them has their own risks, has their own risks theologically. That being said, there's a reason why I make these things, this video. We as trads are so used to dealing with people trying to reduce the positive faith to basically nothing. Saying that you don't need to believe in Jesus to be saved. You don't need to believe in the Blessed Sacrament to be saved. You don't need to believe in the papacy to be saved, which some modern Catholics say, which I still don't understand how they square that with SSPX supposedly being schism and Sedes being in schism a problem, or TLM people who the diocese would publicly say the Latin Mass a problem, since they literally recognize the Pope and obey him fully anyway. I don't realize how that makes sense, but it is a problem, and we are so used to fighting that all the time that we forget that not every single theological disagreement is a matter of faith and morals. This gives some obvious examples of things that are matters of faith and morals. You have to believe in the real presence to be saved. John 6, verses 60 through 69, Jesus not only taught transubstantiation, but he also taught you need to be saved at the end of that dialogue. He was willing to turn away even the 12 apostles. Papacy also believed in that belief is a requirement for salvation. Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, in his work against heresies, the church father, said that all churches, at least in principle, must be united with the See of Peter. Not everything, however, is a matter of faith and morals. So for example, until it was defined in the Council of Florence, I think there were some councils earlier that settled it, but in the really early church, talking pre-Nicaea, there were different dioceses that made their own list of canon of scripture. Now, this was not a total free-for-all like some supporters of Last Gospels believe. Like, Gospel of Judas was never a thing in the Catholic world, ever. That being said, was the book of Apocalypse/Revelation part of the canon? How about the Didache? Is it oral tradition? Is it a handbook? Or is it inspired scripture? The Shepherd of Hermas or Epistle of Barnabas? All of these were debated what their exact status was. And the Septuagint, 1st, 2nd Maccabees, was debated, and there are some canons that had parts of the Septuagint but omitted certain parts of the Masoretic text, depending on where you were. And all these churches were at that time in communion with each other. Clearly now, among Catholics, the canon is a settled question, period. But that was not always the case. And even then, I might get some trad Caths mad at me for saying this, but it is the honest truth. Once upon a time, actually even now, the discussion about whether or not how popes give their jurisdiction, whether directly from God or from God through the Pope, was and is still debated if you look at the Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. Now, yes, clearly bishops need to obey the Pope, certainly as a matter of principle, and even
even the most hardline recognize and resist person would agree that it takes an extraordinary situation to justify disobedience. But how exactly bishops get their jurisdiction is was and technically still is a matter open for debate. Even though, yes, the Pope can theoretically stick his finger to every parish's business and decide how it wants to manage its church potluck, in theory. In theory, Pope can just say, yeah, we're delegating all this to other people, and each diocese can theoretically, within certain reason, make their own liturgy, within certain constraints. And this was actually done in the past many times before. Think about the Sarum Rite in England, the Durham Rite in Durham, and the Mozarabic Rite in Spain and Iberia, and other rites in various other places of the world. So there is and has always been a bit of wiggle room in exactly how things should work. Not all of it is a matter of faith and morals. Another thing, the nature of purgatory. Is it a place of suffering, or is it a place of quiet meditative penance? Most theologians would say, and are probably right, that it is a place of suffering. It has never been infallibly defined out of respect for the Eastern traditions that tends to have more spirituality based around it being a place of quiet meditation and prayer. So there is different ways you can understand theology. Now, what does this have to do with what does this have to do with Sedevacantism versus SSPX versus Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter? Well, here's a simple fact of the matter. The only reason we are so obsessed with this question of what you do with a heretical pope now is because that has a lot of practical implications in our lives as Catholics. If we lived, say, 100 years ago, the question of how do you handle a heretical pope would have been a matter of something for the doctors of the church to discuss and debate over themselves, and the question would have made their heads spin. Now, as for this exact question, to be blunt, and I'm going to make Sedes mad at me. I'm going to make Fraternity of St. Peter mad at me. I'm going to make SSPXers mad at me when I say this. The doctors of the church and saints are divided on this exact question. Period. That is a statement of fact. St. Catherine of Siena said you should obey the Pope, famously, even if he were the devil himself. She clearly would have been Fraternity of St. Peter person. There are other positions, though. One of the Lateran councils, as I recall, thought that if a pope was questionably elected, you would not need a declaration of the church whatsoever. You just stop obeying him, and the cardinals could proceed to elect a new pope, and no one was bound to obey him. They wouldn't need a declaration from the church or anyone whatsoever, just disobey, because he's not a legitimate pope. Thanks, but not today. I have, yes, but thank you. So, anyway, so you can disobey a pope. Also, that is support for the Sedevacanist position. There is also support for the SSPX position, and this is something that Fraternity of St. Peter people and Sedes do not like. Yes, there is cases in church history. Precedent, I know there are church fathers who expressed other opinions. Yes, the Lateran Council says you should obey the Pope. That decree, which I have read, basically means you can't just ignore the Pope because he hasn't invoked infallibility. And you cannot disobey him just because you don't want to. Like, it has to be a positive denial or it has to directly, obeying the Pope would have to mean, in a certain situation, directly disobeying the faith. Like, Holy Father says, even legitimate Holy Father, I put you under obedience. I want you to assassinate this woman. Or I put you under obedience. I want you to be my mistress or lover. you would say, no, Holy Father. And you should say, in that case, no, Holy Father. And there is precedent for this. There is precedent for this in the position in the history of the church. I bring this up multiple times over. St. Maximus the Confessor famously called out Pope Honorius I, knowingly disobeyed his decrees which forbade preaching against the monothelite heresy, and was exiled for it, would not obey, died in his persecutions, and was declared a saint of the church, not in spite of his disobedience, but because of his disobedience. Furthermore, in the Arian crisis at Antioch, what does this heresy issue mean for, in practical terms, the episcopacy of the church? At one point, there were 3 bishops in Antioch. One was an Arian heretic, which Catholics did not recognize. There were 2 Orthodox Catholic bishops. One was elected by a purely Catholic synod of the clergy, and a second one was elected and he was elected by a synod that had some semi-Arians in it. So the question is, which synod was the legitimate one that legitimately elected the bishop? And so even the Orthodox Catholics during the Arian crisis in Antioch were not united. Eventually, after the crisis ended, they basically, one agreed to be the bishop and the other was his coadjudicator, and they all got along happily ever after. Happily, I think both of them are declared saints. But this shows that, yeah, you can be Catholic. You can be take the SSPX position. There can be disagreements among faithful Catholics how exactly this situation should be held. With all due charity, not that these questions don't matter. They do. Yes, under normal circumstances, you obey the Pope. Here's the thing. In case anyone hasn't noticed, these are not normal times in the Catholic Church. Yes, there's corruption, and corruption is bad. But it's unusual to have a large swath of the clergy say you don't need to obey the Catholic faith, just do what I tell you to do. That is highly unusual. That is highly unusual in church history. And the only way that can really make sense is if you want to get rid of faith and replace it with obedience, which, I'm sorry, you need the Catholic faith to be a Catholic. That's why the church actually cared at all about heresy. Otherwise, they could just say, do what the priest says, and who cares what he says, so long as you're doing what he says. That was not how the church handled things. That is not how the church handled things. And if the priest taught heresy, there was grave concern, and he was removed. Also, there is support to an extent, and I'm not favorable to it. Everyone knows this channel lean far more hardline than the Fraternity of St. Peter, but even the priestly Fraternity of St. Peter just obey no matter what. So Honorius I, who St. Maximus the Confessor, was famous for resisting, played a big role in the evangelization of England. And he communicated with saints, and there were saints in England who were bishops who obeyed him. Now, to be fair, these saints were basically at the end of the world and totally unaware of what Honorius was doing with regards to monothelite heresy. Completely ignorant. And once they heard wind of what was going on in the rest of the church, it was after Honorius had died, they were horrified and investigated the clergy and all their laity, and they were happy to find out that no one believed in this heresy in England. So basically, yes, so it's just one of the reasons why I do believe there can be, even though I do not recognize the post-Vatican II church, there can be sections that are not affected in it. For example, I know for a fact that there are a lot of Eastern Catholics, even some people, because they're kind of in a more conservative bubble, are not aware of things like fiducia supplicans. And if you heard about it, they would freaking be horrified. Happily. Now, I will give a caution against this. Each of these positions can have their dangers. Yes, the SSPX position, if you take it to an extreme, and I do know there are a few, especially in the United States, some trads to do this. you can justify disobedience in just everything you do not like. So, for example, there are a lot of conservative, traditional Catholic Americans in the States who do not like Pope Francis's teaching on immigration. Here's the thing. Pope Francis on immigration is 100% in line with pre-Vatican II teaching. If you ask me to give, I challenge anyone to give me an example of a pope. Like when it comes to the popes and what they have taught, he's exactly in line with Pius XII. Same with Pope Leo. Nothing to criticize him there. So that is a danger. The Sedes and the Fraternity of St. Peter also have a dangerous error, which there can never be a situation where you disagree a superior, something which Aquinas was obviously against. In his Summa, he clearly taught against that. There are cases when it is required to disobey your superiors. So that contradicts previous Catholic teaching. And the Fraternity of St. Peter is in particular danger, because if you follow St. Teresa of St. Catherine of Siena's advice and obey the Pope, even if he's the devil, guess where you're going to end up? Literally hell. You will literally go to hell if you obey the devil. I don't care what his position in the church is. If you know he's the devil, do not do what he's telling you to do. You do not disobey. You do not disobey a general's orders to keep the command of your corporal. You obey the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The Pope is the vicar of Christ, but Jesus Christ is King. And what he has taught is, sorry to anyone who says, well, how do we know if the Pope doesn't tell me what the faith is? So the priest doesn't say, who am I to know what the Catholic faith is? A Catholic. That is your job. It is the job of everyone here watching this to know the Catholic faith in this day and age according to state and life, and we live in the internet age. You're required to know it quite well. I'm sorry. That is your duty. Anyway, just thought I'd make this video as I came to the Holy Sepulchre. God bless. Have a great day. If you give it a chance in real life, please check out SSPX Church. God bless.